Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this session. And the purpose of our session now is to provide a broad overview of all of the great water quality work that's being done across the state of Nebraska. This panel doesn't encompass everyone doing water quality work, but we have experts from 6 different sectors. We're going to showcase their unique viewpoints and initiatives while also highlighting some of the issues that unite and provide collaboration between individuals. Our hope is this panel will illuminate areas for potential partnership. So in this session, each of our experts will speak for 8 minutes. After everyone is finished, we'll have an audience Q&A, so if you can hang on to your questions throughout the speakers and save those for the end. Our first speaker is Dr. Chittaranjan Ray. Dr. Ray joined the leadership team of the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute in 2013 as director of the Nebraska Water Center. Prior to this role, he was director of the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Hawaii, which, like the Nebraska Water Center, is part of a network of more than 54 water research institutes. Dr. Ray is a civil engineer by training and has extensive experience in many facets of managing both water quantity and quality. So let's welcome Dr. Ray.
Thank you, Shannon. So I'm going to focus to kick it off with nitrate, groundwater, and food production. So this is a set of pictures from the Wessel's living farm. You know what happened in the late 20s or early 30s, the Dust Bowl, the demise of the family farms, and but then fortunes changed. Nebraska, the discovery of groundwater and irrigation really changed the fortune. But this also helped a lot of farm families to have a predictable future in terms of income and put their kids to college. And this also changed a lot of things over the last several decades. So then came the Green Revolution in the 60s. US played a major role in feeding the humanity throughout the world. If you remember, like in the 60s, the public law PL 480 sent a lot of food to countries like India, Africa, everywhere, that ground corn with powdered milk and sugar. That was the easy to transport, and KR is the one which, and USA, it's a predecessor to USAID. So that was feeding the humanity really. So 3 things made this possible: the hybrid seeds, Norman Borlaug's work, water for irrigation, and nitrogen fertilizer. So nitrogen became very cheap because the Haber-Bosch process, which is basically an industrial process using metal catalyst under high temperature and high pressure to use the atmospheric nitrogen gas and methane. Actually, hydrogen is the other gas which comes out of methane production process to make anhydrous ammonia. But then people learned that in temperate climates, anhydrous ammonia can be applied to the ground and it will convert to ammonium ion. So plants can take up nitrogen in the form of from ammonium or nitrate, in either of the 2 forms. So Nebraska has plenty of groundwater, and then the discovery of, the invention of turbine pumps made pumping much easier. So we had surface water before, but that was subject to climate issues or weather issues and all that. So groundwater became a more reliable source for irrigation. And as you know that if you look at the landscape here, Hastings, Kearney, a lot of these manufacturing companies, pumps or valves and all these things happened over the years. So Nebraska irrigation was significant, as you say, well drilling to turbine pumps. So deep well turbine pumps made that water pumping much easier. So then we had these for irrigation, growing corns, row crops. Then if you look at the irrigation happening around the world, 325 million hectares, so maybe you can multiply that 2.5 times, maybe 800 million or so acres. So China and India, they each about 65 million hectares, and US about 26 million hectares, so about 60 million or so acres. So Nebraska, and then I can divide this into 2 parts, as you see in the pictures on the right side. The front picture, the central part is the high plains Ogallala Aquifer, so Nebraska has the major lion's share of that water. Then we have the Central Valley and the Mississippi embayment aquifers. And then some minor aquifers in the west and Texas also. But the surface water part is quite dispersed, Texas, Idaho, other places also. But as you look at the bottom picture there, so the irrigation well density in Nebraska is quite high. Some places it can be 4 wells per square mile. So the technology development went on in the 60s, and now we have reached quite significant milestone in terms of irrigation in Nebraska. The 4 major companies, they enjoy 90% of the market share. They are in Nebraska. But then what has happened? That nitrate contamination. That especially we are in an alluvial aquifer system, so the loss of nitrogen or nitrate that's applied to crops, that has contaminated groundwater. Especially you can see there are 2 or 3 big areas along the Platte River corridor, then northeast Nebraska, now in the Blue River. So these are the emerging areas. And it's impacting not only the individual domestic wells, but also nearby municipalities. The cost of mitigation is quite high. And the trend is rising, which is quite disturbing. And there is a lot of storage in the Vedova zone. And if we even stop farming today, it's not going to go away. So you look at this decadal rise in nitrate, 70s, 80s, 90s, all these 10-year intervals. You can see these red areas are growing, and the reds are more than 10. So the next picture is going to give you a little more statistics here. So if we divide the state into the east side or the west side, on the eastern side, of course, more irrigation. So about 40% of the land under gravity irrigation will exceed nitrate contamination, nitrate standards. And under pivot, maybe 35%, but in the west, a little bit less. And then the thing here is that this is a picture I got from my colleague Dan Snow. They show the layering of the soils in Hastings area, and we had 30 plus more boreholes. And we try to look into the content of nitrate as well as other contaminants. Primarily, I'm going to limit to nitrate and ammonium. The next figure, you can see that there are 3 panels here. So the vertical depth is about 80 to 90 feet range or so. So the first figure here is to the left, that's nitrate. And then the next is ammonium. So that goes for a pivot irrigation, gravity irrigation, and the next is dry land. Look at the middle one, the gravity irrigation shows higher nitrate than the pivot irrigation or dry land. And both have high ammonium also. So the question I was posing that it's not going to go away. So we have to probably deal with this with a lot of questions. How did this happen? What went wrong? What are the consequences, health or economic? How can we solve the problem? What is this going to cost us? And finally, how long it will take to have that water that is safe to drink? So I'm going to stop here because my other colleagues will probably pick it up from here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. Next, we have Dickerman. Dick is currently a water resources specialist with the Lower Platte South NRD in Lincoln. He manages the district's groundwater quality and quantity monitoring programs. He has 30 years of experience in Nebraska at the state and local level, focusing on regional groundwater analysis and monitoring. He's a licensed professional geologist and is also an adjunct instructor of geology and liberal arts at Doane University. So let's welcome Dickerman to the stage.
Thanks, Shannon, and I want to thank Chittaranjan and Jesse and Megan and everybody else for the invitation to be here. Although after I accepted this invitation, I found out I was on an expert panel. And there are enough of you in the audience who know me well enough to know how utterly hilarious that is, that I should be up here. But one thing I do know a fair amount about is Nebraska's natural resources districts. And I just want to talk a few minutes about what we do and some of the things that we are trying to move into in the future. Now, I see a lot of my NRD colleagues out here in the audience, so this is going to be utterly familiar to you. So if you want to, take an 8-minute nap, that'll probably be okay too. For those of you who don't know much about the NRD system, and I think many of you, if not most of you do, just a real brief history. We've been around since about 1972. We're delineated according to watershed boundaries. We're governed by locally elected boards and then run day to day by professional staffs. One of the most unique things about NRDs across the country and really the world is that we do have our own property taxing authority, which sets us apart from a lot of the other conservation districts in the country. Oops, let's see, what am I doing here? There's next. And this is just a map of the 23 NRDs spread across the state. They range from the smaller ones, the one you're in here, the Lower Platte South NRD is about 1 million acres. You go a little bit west to the Lower Loop NRD, which is the biggest one in the state, which is several times that. So it really varies depending upon where you're at in the state, the size and the reach of each of those districts. We have several areas of statutory responsibility. Obviously, what we're talking about here today is mostly water, but statutorily in Nebraska, we have quite a few other responsibilities: soil, flood control, recreation, and those sorts of things. So we're not just limited to water. We do a lot of different things. Oops. I'll get this done yet. As far as groundwater authorities go, it's important to remember that Nebraska's NRDs are limited to non-point sources of contamination. That is, the diffuse sources that come from such things as application of fertilizers and manure, which John just talked about. Point sources are taken care of by the State Department of Environment and Energy. Tatiana will talk a little bit about some of their authorities and what they're doing here in just a bit. But NRDs do their groundwater activities mainly through the implementation of groundwater management plans and management areas. These management areas are typically designated by the NRD themselves, but in some cases they've been designated through cooperation with the state. Again, we do have statutory authority to control a variety of groundwater activities for groundwater quality and quantity, although we'll focus on quality here. Best management practices, educational requirements, reporting, and a variety of other general authorities that we have. Typically across the state, when it comes to implementing these controls or these regulations or these activities, whatever you want to call it, most NRDs use what you can call as a phase approach. This was an approach that was pioneered by Ron Bishop in the Central Platte NRD back in the 1980s. Many of you remember Ron. Really a giant in the field in Nebraska. Typically, this phase approach is based on nitrate levels in monitoring wells. NRDs monitor a variety of groundwater wells across the state. We started off with existing wells, irrigation, domestic, stuff like that, but many NRDs are really getting into the business of installing dedicated monitoring wells for specific purposes in specific locations. This presentation is a little bit old. When I did it last time, I dumped it from the state database, and there's something over 2,000 dedicated monitoring wells in 23 NRDs. I know it's more than that now. I don't know the exact number. These typically are sampled at least annually, but again, particularly with dedicated monitoring wells, they can be sampled as often as you want. And then we have to submit that data to the Department of Environment and Energy. That is then contained within a statewide clearinghouse database, which I believe Tatiana will talk a little bit about as well. The important thing to remember here is that the NRD's management programs are set up to kind of respond to increasing levels of contamination. Typically, these increasing levels of nitrate or other contaminants trigger increasingly stringent or increasingly tight controls. Those triggers are typically a percentage of the maximum contaminant level. If we're talking about nitrate, that's 10 milligrams per liter. Just as an example, for the Lower Platte South NRD, where we are here and where I work, the entire NRD is in a phase 1 management area. In a given area, if half of our monitoring wells are exceeding half of the MCL, we go to phase 2. If 80% of those monitoring wells exceed 80% of the MCL, we go to phase 3, and then we have increasing requirements for those phase areas. The majority of NRDs do have phase 1 and phase 2 areas. Only a few phase 3 or higher areas exist across the state, but there are a few of them. As far as I know right now, there are no groundwater management areas for groundwater quality for any contaminant other than nitrate. So if any of my NRD colleagues know that I'm wrong on that, please correct me. There's a variety of controls and regulations that we're authorized to use, but typically within an NRD management area, there's an educational certification requirement that anybody that requires nitrogen fertilizer has to be certified to do that, typically every 4 years or something like that. In many cases, NRDs are requiring farmers to do soil sampling for residual nitrogen carryover so they can reduce their fertilizer application. And then sampling irrigation water for nitrogen credit. In some cases, there's a lot of nitrogen contained within the irrigation water, and applications can be reduced by that same amount. Many NRDs also adopt timing restrictions for fertilization, basically with the idea of being that the shorter time that fertilizer is on the ground and in the soil, there's less chance for it to convert to a leachable form and get into the groundwater. And again, these requirements typically step up as you go through these phases. Now, I don't expect you to be able to see this map or read it, the details on it, but this is just a map that the Nebraska Association of Resources Districts puts out, and it just summarizes all of the 23 NRD's requirements, and there's a website address if you're interested in getting a copy of that map. So just to kind of summarize what we're trying to do here. NRDs have decades of experience with individuals and local governments, so we are a presence out there within the communities. We need continued research on water quantity and quality science, but particularly at this point, what we're doing here today, to talk about the health effects of groundwater problems. Historically, it's focused on the hard science. Where's the nitrate? How much is there? How did it get there? Now we need to start talking more about, okay, what's the effect of both nitrate and emerging contaminants on people of the state? And that's what we need the help of these health experts for. So with that, I think I'm going to shut up, and if you have any questions, we'll deal with them later on. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dick. Next up, we have Dr. Don Coulter. Don is a pediatric oncologist specializing in hematology. In addition to his clinical practice at Nebraska Medical Center, he currently serves as a professor of pediatrics at UNMC, and he maintains an active research program. He currently serves as director of the Pediatric Cancer Research Group, a multidisciplinary team of researchers developing novel therapeutics for pediatric tumors. Let's welcome Dr. Coulter.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you. I think we've heard about nitrogen and we've heard about NRDs, and what I want to talk to you is about how both of those things interplay in health in Nebraska and how important it is that we all work together to sort that out. So that we're all up to speed, in the United States, approximately 15,000 children a year are diagnosed with cancer. And of those 15,000 children, about 80% of them will survive. But part of the problem is the survivors of pediatric cancer go on to have long-term healthcare issues that usually need to be treated by subspecialists. About 75% of kids who survive cancer have long-term impacts. And we don't know what causes pediatric cancer. We know there are two causes, ionizing radiation and unfortunately pediatric oncologists, because the therapy that I give somebody to treat their cancer can cause a secondary cancer later on. But we do know, as with many other diseases, that there are genetic factors and that there are environmental factors that are at play. And with all of the chronic illnesses that we see, especially in children, social determinants of health are critical. And at that point, all of these things sort of interconnect in the ways that water in Nebraska can be problematic in this equation. A couple of years ago, the Center for Disease Control did a study of 12 years looking at pediatric cancer rates throughout the United States of America, and they found that Nebraska has the 7th highest incidence of pediatric cancer in the country. This incidence in Nebraska not only exceeds the national average, but is the highest incidence in the 12 states that make up the Midwest region of the United States. If you look at this, you'll see that the first 6 states are all in the Northeast, and that's been the way that the epidemiology of pediatric cancer in the United States has worked out for a long period of time, that the Northeast has the highest incidence, but Nebraska has a very high incidence as well. When we look at the Midwest, we can see that Nebraska has the highest incidence, and the incidence within the state of Nebraska exceeds the incidence for the Midwest region as well. Work that was done by our team, and specifically people who are here like Dr. Rogan, mapped out where these different diseases of cancer come from within our state, and where in our state it exceeded the incidence that you would think within the state. And what you're looking at in this map of counties is any county that is red or brown exceeds the incidence that you would expect within the state for cancer within that county in an age-adjusted rate. So now what we have is two problems. We have the issue of having an increased incidence of cancer within the state of Nebraska, but we also have a geospatial variation of how it presents. So if you have cancer and you're in Omaha, that's where I and my 8 colleagues who treat cancer work, and that's the only place that you can go in Nebraska to get care for pediatric cancer. If you live in Grand Island, if you live in Hastings, if you live in Scotts Bluff, that distance becomes more and more problematic. So as we're working through these issues, we can see that there's an issue also with how we're putting that healthcare out towards the state. When we were looking at these maps, we noticed that that band of those red and brown colors sort of exceeds through the center of the map. And thinking about environmental and genetic causes, we were thinking about what could be the environmental causes that are around. You know, a county line is just a geopolitical construct. It tells you nothing about an environmental exposure. And a watershed gives you a better idea of what possible exposures someone could have within that watershed that might be from different counties. So these maps, done by Dr. Rogan and her team, show watersheds throughout Nebraska. And in the upper left, you see the incidence of pediatric brain tumors throughout Nebraska. And anywhere that's red in those watersheds exceeds the national average of pediatric brain tumor incidence. To the right of that is leukemia. To the bottom left is lymphoma. So you can see that there are definitely areas within the state where we see an increase in of cancer. And when we saw that, some of the things that came out is what could happen in those watersheds are things like row cropping, different things like that. So that led us to consider the Ogallala Aquifer, which you've already talked about this morning. And the Ogallala Aquifer is naturally contaminated with uranium and has high levels of nitrate in it as well. And when those two molecules are together, it makes the uranium more bioavailable. This work done by Carrie Weber here at UNL shows the Ogallala Aquifer and that contamination, but it is just spot checks. There are places that we don't necessarily know exactly what that data is telling us because there are holes in our data records from wells about what is in those wells. But as we've talked about, we've seen that nitrate is continuing to increase in the state. Nitrate we know causes pediatric diseases like methemoglobinemia in babies, but we think that there's an incidence of cancer that can be correlated to nitrate and other agrochemicals that are at use. These are some of the agrochemicals that are listed, and you can see that in many, many well samples, they exceed the reporting limit that you would want. And so now we're back to the issue that this is impacting our rural populations, because 1/3 of the people who live in the state live in rural areas. And in those areas where farming communities and agriculture are so important in the economic engine for what we do, if there is a problem with nitrates and agrochemicals that could be increase the incidence of pediatric cancer or other chronic diseases, this can be incredibly telling. As we were listening to the keynote this morning about the problems of indigenous people with water, there are studies that have been done about arsenic on reservations that people who have arsenic in their urine supplies actually have higher incidence of cardiomyopathy. So we know that there are some links to heavy metals and different diseases in our people. So what can we do about this? First, just like Dick said, I think sitting and talking about it is incredibly important, but understanding that we have a problem in Nebraska. We have an increased incidence of cancer within our state, but we also have a geospatial diversity about how those people are dispersed throughout the state. So we have two things that we have to figure out. One, what do we do about this water issue? And two, while we're figuring that out, how do we take care of a rural population that needs subspecialty care that comes at a distance? Because the impact of our rural communities is incredibly paramount to our state and our future. Thank you so much for your time.
Don. Next up, we have Crystal Powers. Crystal connects research and extension faculty throughout Nebraska with water and cropping system professionals to work on issues related to environmental contamination and nitrate. Crystal currently co-leads the Nebraska Nitrate Strategy Group, which is working to create a broad coalition to support solutions for our nitrate challenges. Welcome, Crystal.
Thanks, Shannon. Just make sure it's close enough to pick me up. All right, so just to flip over, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways we are already been working on this together. And so we can hopefully hit the ground running as we move into these next steps. And Katie Picard is my co-leader, and she's around. Oh, she's here in the back as well. So if you have any questions or want to talk more, feel free to reach out to either one of us. We did just get our summary done of the last year's worth of activities, and that's on the information desk out front if you want a paper copy. If you want an electronic copy, which got a few more details, get a hold of one of us, and we will make sure you get that in your hands. So this is just a really snippet of what's been going on. There's been a lot of great work well before this timeline, and we're sitting here as we move forward. So this is just a quick snippet, and I realize that I'm like, this is kind of a me-centric, so I apologize for that. But this is how I've been involved. It's maybe a better way to say it. But there was an extension group that I was able to join in. So they have been working on this for some time. And we decided we really need to get our faculty together to talk about what have we done and where do we want to go. So back in 2019, that was mostly UNL folks. I know there were a couple of UNMC people, but we talked about we really want to get a broader perspective on how we move forward. It was the focus of our Nebraska Water Conference also in 2019. I know many of you were at that, and so that was a great piece of the discussion. And then we come to January of last year, pre-COVID, we got a group together. I think there were 50 or so folks to say, how do we want to move this forward, acknowledging what we've done, but moving forward in new ways. And so out of that, some working groups were convened. So throughout this whole process, we've wanted to have a very multi-sector, broad emphasis. What are some things that we can all move forward together? We're all doing lots of really great things individually, but how do we work together? So I know this is a long list, but it's just to acknowledge that there were a lot of people involved giving a lot of great input about what they're already doing and how we might work well together as we move forward. And so the outcome of the January meeting, which was kind of just our first brainstorming, was a very basic goal. We all in Nebraska should have access to safe water, which is something very easy to agree to, much harder to get done. So in order to start to work on that, 3 key areas were identified. That was awareness and communication and building trust was kind of all in that category. Policy, and then finally education. And there was both how do we reach out to our young students in K-12, as well as our ag producers throughout the state. So with that, we convened these working groups who met throughout COVID. So we met in various ways. We did all electronic, we did some in person and some hybrid. So thank you for those of you in the room who are in those for working with us through COVID so we could keep moving forward. The awareness group, their goal that they came up with out of that group was to connect all Nebraskans to actionable information about their water quality. And so we kind of view this as kind of the fundamental piece of how can we all work together? There's lots of really great individual efforts, but what pieces do we need to kind of work together on? So 4 main action items. We've got a lot more details in the full proposal, so please do check that out. But there's 4 main action items. The first is to develop shared communications resources. So these are kind of just the basics. Many of the things we're talking about here, things that, our extension people, our NRD, INE folks, these things we already do, but let's put them together, have some shared messaging, maybe go as far as having some a logo or just so we can kind of all have this presence. So when you hear many voices saying the same thing, it tends to resonate. And then the second piece of that, once we kind of have our content developed, is helping local citizens be prepared to engage in the topic and to champion. And it really helps to have those local trusted messengers. And so we've got some steps in there about how we can train local leaders to better engage on the topic. The third action item then is once we've got those people and content, how do we deliver it to the general public? And so we've got some steps on how we can deliver that programming across the state, whether that's in person or virtually or through social media. And finally, there was an interest in creating a Nebraska water quality app to help get all this great clearinghouse data and beach watch data and Vado zone data. We have a lot of really great data. How do we get it in people's hands so they can make informed decisions? So we've got some faculty and partners already working together to create an app. The other group that had a pretty strong proposal is our policy working group. It's still, I would say, at the beginning stages, but there was some broad consensus to encourage equitable adoption of behaviors to address nitrate issues. And so, we've got a long history from the NRDs of already working through local policy items, but how can we do this as a state? So the current proposal is to have a fertilizer checkoff, which faces many hurdles yet, as policy often does, but we had everybody staying at the table. We had the ag groups there, we had those, and they're willing to continue to talk and discuss this so that we can move forward on a policy proposal. And so we've got one of the pieces that we have in there as well is what we need from you. And so in this one, we need those who are interested in moving it forward to the next phases. We're glad to still facilitate, but from our side, we need to let the policy folks take off with this one. And so with that, we have so the education group met, and there was a lot of great discussion, and we have a lot of really great educational programming across the state. And so everyone was like, well, let's continue to support this piece, but they felt like the awareness campaign was really kind of the linchpin. So there's a lot of overlap in that awareness and education, because people need to be ready for the education. And so they kind of got folded together. And so we want to continue to support our activities, mutually reinforcing activities that all the organizations are doing, and kind of focus in on the awareness piece, and then kind of stay nimble. This is just our first phase. So as things get rolling, then if there's a need for new educational programming, we've got the partners to get it done. So with that, I will stop. Like I said, we hope to hit the ground running here, really bring in this health component to the discussion. So I'll look forward to our discussion later today. Thanks.
Well, we will go ahead then with our fifth and sixth speaker. So I'm going to introduce Brandon Honeycutt. Brandon is a fifth generation farmer who currently farms with his father and brother, raising corn, soybeans, popcorn, seed corn, and also doing some organic production. Their farms try to stay on the cutting edge of technology, whether that is implementation of cover crops, or also how to use data to better manage water in their pivot irrigation systems. Brandon is currently on the National Corn Growers Association Board of Directors, Vice Chair of the Nebraska Corn Board, and Chair of the Field to Market Board of Directors. So please help me in welcoming Brandon.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and to me this is a very important topic, because as I sit through the presentation, sit through the discussions, realize that where our farm sits, we sit in Hamilton County, which is part of the Upper Big Blue NRD. So we get the double whammy of a very high incident of childhood cancer and high nitrates in the groundwater. Sitting in an area that is very vital to production of corn within the state of Nebraska, from everything from seed corn to popcorn, corn for ethanol production, and white corn, you name it, it's right in that corridor. And so this hits close to home, because we've seen the challenges of the environmental factors, we've seen the challenges of friends with cancer, we've seen all of those. So it's not just about being a farmer, it's about being a good steward of the land. And on our farm, we have really taken an approach over the last handful of years to try to figure out how can we better manage water and nitrates on our farm while maintaining yields, because we know at the end of the day, we need to make sure we have food, feed, fiber, and fuel for the world. And we can't go backwards on that. We have a challenge moving forward, feeding 9, 10 billion people by 2050, how are we going to accomplish that? But at the same time, being the stewards of the ground. So on our own farm, we've really taken the approach of how can we monitor the amount of water we're using? Because we began to realize that over the years, we were using more water than what we really needed to. So we go back to 1988, to the last major drought that really affected us in Nebraska. And, we weren't running as many center pivots as we were. We weren't running them as we are now. But by estimations, I was playing baseball. What do I know? I was in high school. But just based on having to help haul pipe and all the fun stuff on the farm, we were probably put on 20 to 30 inches of groundwater to not raise the yield that we are now. Fast forward to 2012, and we know by the data that we inputted into the Upper Big Blue NRD that we put on about 10 acre inches of water, which is fascinating, and we're able to maintain yields. Why is that important? Is because we also know that we're not pushing nitrates down to the groundwater. And we started doing this about 15 years ago by using nitrogen or water sensors to really monitor what's going on in the soil so we can better utilize our pivots, better utilize our water. And it's been a fascinating journey to go from really cheap sensors to ones that we've just installed that are ground penetrating radar that sit on the pivot. That instead of one data point, we're getting 200 data points on each circle of the pivot. And seeing multiple people look at these things and they keep telling us, yeah, don't water. Even this year, like, yeah, don't put any water out there. And we've got neighbors that we have put on probably 6 acre inches of water this year in a year that's through March, April, May was wetter than 2019 for us. And I've got a really bad feeling of what that's going to do to the nitrate levels in our area over time as we're just going to keep driving them up. We've also taken the approach of how do we utilize cover crops? How do we utilize the technology out there? And how can we make this work so we can even use less and less fertilizer? We're seeing it on our organic field. That's kind of our experimental ground, is that we're trying to figure out we can't use synthetic fertilizer. So what natural occurring sources can we utilize? So we're using cover crops there. We're also seeing some fascinating research into biologicals, whether it's over the top of the growing corn crop to help it use nitrogen out of the air, or whether it's using soil amendments that will help the soil microbes better utilize what we have in the soil, hopefully driving up organic matter, which will in turn allow us to use less fertilizer in the future. These are the things we're trying right now. We don't know how well they'll work. There's a lot of experimental stuff on our farm right now, waiting to go on in this growing season to see what it looks like. But we think it holds huge promise. We think it has some potential to really be a game changer within agriculture. Because if we can utilize less fertilizer, we know how much benefit that'll be, not just on our own farm from a cost perspective, but for environmental reasons as a whole. And one of the challenges we run into in farming, especially in Nebraska, is we never talk water quality. We talk water quantity, because what are we concerned about is the Ogallala Aquifer. We do not want to be Texas. We do not want to be southwestern Kansas, which to be very blunt, have really screwed it up for the rest of us because they haven't figured out how not to water, and they'll water all the time and just run it dry. We don't want to do that. So when we talk to our counterparts in other parts of the United States, it makes me take pause. 2 weeks ago, we were out in Cleveland, so we're right on Lake Erie. They came in and talked about Lake Erie. One of the former National Corn Growers presidents sits on the Chesapeake Bay, so we talk Chesapeake Bay. We talk all these other issues, but we don't talk about it here. Most of the time, farmers will get upset when you talk water quality. They don't want to talk about nitrates in the water. They don't want to do the reporting, but it's important. It's important to be able to do that, and we need to make that shift from quantity to quality, and have those discussions within agriculture and within farming in Nebraska. And it's great to see the working groups that are being put together. I will say, another checkoff on fertilizer gives me pause. But try to figure out how I'm selling that one to the other farmers in the state. I'm going to leave that up to Boone, from one of our great staff from the Nebraska Corn Board, to That's on him. But it is vitally important, and I think we can make a huge shift here in agriculture, and I think we can find the way to do it. But one of the challenges is when it comes down to things like cost and timing. When we look at fertilizer production, or fertilizer usage, we cannot put any anhydrous on in our area until after November 1. Well, the reason guys use anhydrous is A, it's cheap, and B, it comes down to how many people are on the farm to work. Well, if you're running a one-man crew, you do it after harvest, you get it done, you don't worry about it till the next spring, and I'm going to put on an extra 50 pounds an acre because I'm going to lose some over the winter, and I don't want to lose yield, and I need to make sure the landlords are happy. So we have that issue. The other thing is to implement some of these practices, it does take a lot of money. And we need to start developing more and more private and public partnerships to help move that along. Because if farmers have the ability to try things, they'll try it, but they're not as willing to put it out from their own pocket. And partly that's because you have the challenge of landlords, you have the challenge of high land costs, you have the challenge of high tax rates, and anything that may cause them to go backwards, that gives them pause. But if we come up with the right solutions that everybody can work together on, everybody wins. And I love the presentation on the indigenous people, because I thought that was a key moment to make me realize that we need to work together. And it doesn't matter if it's myself in the university or myself and Native American tribes, whoever the case might be. We need to work together. We need to find those partnerships to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Our next speaker is Tatiana Davila. Tatiana is a hydrogeologist in the Water Quality Division of the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. She coordinates the Wellhead Protection and source water protection programs across the state. So let's welcome Tatiana.
So I just want to thank Jesse and the Water Climate Health Program and everyone for inviting me to be here today. My name is Tatiana, and I manage 2 voluntary programs across the state with DEE. And I know Dick teed me up really well with some things that I'm going to talk about, but I'm actually not going to talk about those things that he said. So I'm going to start off. So this is kind of funny, because when I was making this presentation, my initial title was, why groundwater? And then I thought, gosh, Tatiana, that's so ridiculous. Like, all the reasons and the crowd that you're talking to, we don't even need to belabor how important groundwater is, especially in the state of Nebraska. But as Mike was speaking this morning in his introduction, he was talking about 70% of the High Plains aquifer. So I just wanted to put this image up here of the total saturation of the aquifer, just to show, again, right, the majority of this great resource lies underneath us. And I know this is redundant for a lot of people in this room right now, but it is a big deal. And I kind of say that tongue in cheek. But some quick numbers. A lot of you are already aware that most Nebraskans drink groundwater, so over 88%. And then if we don't look at Omaha MUD, that number jumps up to 95%, because Omaha sources their water from surface water in the Missouri. So we have 598 public water systems across the state that serve 1.5 million people. And of those, 583 are small systems. So that means they serve fewer than 10,000 residents. And then domestic wells. So this is kind of a fuzzy gray area, because wells actually weren't required to be registered prior to 1993. But Chitteranjon and I actually were chatting this morning and kind of maybe guesstimating, just looking at population, maybe 400,000 people are on domestic wells, so maybe 200,000 domestic wells across the state. We really don't know. So NDE roles in groundwater. As Dick mentioned earlier, we are the authority parallel to the NRDs. We work closely with the NRDs to regulate non-point source pollution. And for anyone not familiar what that is, there's a nice photo up there. So that's essentially runoff. If you think of, it's a hodgepodge of pollution. You don't know exactly where the source is, or as opposed to point source pollution, which is this other photograph, which is you can identify right away. So DE also regulates point source pollution. So the 2 voluntary programs that are administered by us are 2 programs that I coordinate across the state, and they're very similar. They're essentially based on source water protection, which is looking at all of the water that is on or in the subsurface that could be used for drinking water, is already being used for drinking water, or that communities want to site wells in the future. So it's anything in this region. And that source water protection is delineated by looking at your wellhead protection area. So what is this kind of like sweet spot around the community system wells where we could be sourcing water from? That's our priority for protecting it. So these two programs kind of work in tandem. The one I kind of want to talk about a little bit more today is the source water protection program, because in this program, we actually administer funding through grants for small communities. So those are those systems with fewer than 10,000 people to protect their water. And that's through things like cost sharing, things like cover crops. So the stuff that Brandon's working on. So working with farmers, working with urban folks to address fertilizer for not only in their yards, but maybe on golf courses, mitigating contaminants through like proper closure of wells, outreach and education. I mean, the sky's the limit when you're thinking of what projects we can fund. So this is just a map of a typical wellhead protection area, and I just wanted to show you kind of what it looks like, but I'm not going to go into what everything is because I just have 4 minutes left. But those time of travel paths show us where the groundwater is being sourced from. So the green are at the wellheads, and then we can kind of look, okay, this is the area that we need to protect. So community-driven planning. So when I say community, I don't mean just like a public water system or just the people who are drinking the water on a community system, right? It's everyone in that region. It's everyone within the wellhead protection area, because we know the links between groundwater and surface water and different aquifers. So we know that it's all interconnected. We've been working on some really exciting things within our agency and then collaborating with other partners to essentially try to get more money behind this protection, right? So my program with the source water grants, it's kind of small peanuts because I can, administer maybe $20,000 to $60,000 for communities. But we've actually kind of unlocked this mechanism for communities to come in under the non-point source pollution program and access upwards of $300,000 each, like every 3 years, to protect their groundwater. And that's doing things like cost share, doing things like mitigation, education, and outreach. So we've kind of recently discovered and worked together to get this really collaborative and powerful thing under the guise of a drinking water protection management plan. But now it's like, okay, how do we let people know about this? How do we get to communities and say, hey, we have this awesome resource. It's not the end all be all, but it can really help you. So that leads me into kind of my shameless plug for this thing that I'm working on right now. So this is kind of nestled under the statewide nitrate groups that Crystal was talking about. So this proposal was kind of our idea for a statewide campaign, for lack of a better term, that links these three pillars that I think are really, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, are really pivotal. So hydrogeology, public health, and soil health. So I just started in this position in August 2019. So I was out in communities for about 6 months before the pandemic hit, and then kind of spent the whole year thinking about, okay, how can this work? But I was giving a lot of talks about the importance of hydrogeology and contaminant movement. And being a geologist, the talks were really geology heavy, but like groundwater 101. And I was getting really good feedback from that. People were really interested in their local water sources and their geology, which got me really excited, thinking, hey, if we empower people with information about their public water or their local geology or their local soil health, maybe we can drive some engagement behind this. So this is kind of where this kind of trifecta came from. So these questions are things that we're looking at because it's all interconnected, right? So the practices that Brandon's doing on his farm directly tie into the quality of the water, and then that directly ties into what Don was talking about with her public health, and that's kind of the whole reason we're here. So I'm here today to ask, will you collaborate with us? Because there are so many ways that we can work together on something like this. And so our goal is to empower communities with the information about our hydrogeology, public health, and soil health, amplify the messages and the work that has already been done, because as we know, there's been people in this field for decades. I mean, I've only been here for less than 2 years, but a lot of you have been working on this issue for many, many years. So I want to hear your voices and your input and hear what's been done before and what doesn't work. And I want to co-produce knowledge with you, right? We have a kind of a long-standing pattern of coming into communities as the experts and then saying, okay, here's the solution and here's what needs to happen. But I'm really interested as well in what traditional ecological knowledge do we already have? What local knowledge do we already have? Because the people who are in these communities are the people who know the best about their current situations in terms of the geology, the public health, and the soil health. So I'm here looking for opportunities for collaboration, and with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Well, I just want to start our Q&A by thanking all of our experts for introducing us to their work and sharing their unique perspectives on our water and health challenges for the state of Nebraska. At this time, we'll kind of go into a Q&A session. I think Megan will tell me how much time we have for Q&A or someone, but I think we have a little bit of time. Okay, maybe we don't. Okay, perfect. We have 20 minutes. So with that, I would just invite this to be a time of asking questions and hearing from our panel and sharing among ourselves. So if you have questions, maybe come to the mics in the center to ask those. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll maybe ask a kickoff question of the panel members, which is, as I was listening to the talks, I really was excited about all of the different voices that have been brought together today to talk about water and water quality, but I guess maybe I would ask the panelists to maybe give their feedback on who is missing in the conversation so far. If we could bring in some other perspectives or other voices from each of your perspectives, who could help us solve these challenges that maybe isn't currently at the table? I'm going to throw that out there.
We have Brandon representing the producer, but there is a group of industry. They connect the producers with the rural economy, especially the crop consultants, the grain elevator people, or that's one sector. The second could be the finance people also, the banks and all that. So they also. So those two groups probably we need to bring sometime.
Another group I'd add to it, which they've been engaged at times, but we need to make sure their voices are loud and clear, are municipalities and small communities and private well owners, because there's different barriers that all those different scales face. And so kind of thinking about solutions that fit for their size is really important. And as a parents of children, those are, you need to have, having done a lot of messaging and communication, you want to be thoughtful in how you engage folks, but they're very passionate about their children's health. And so finding ways to have them have the information so that they can direct that passion is really critical too.
And I guess, Shem, I would just add, I really appreciate what Brandon has to say, and certainly, his perspective from his kind of operation is vital. But, we can't forget that there are a lot of different sectors in the ag business, and that's something that I deal with on a daily basis here in the Lower Platte South NRD, where much of our crop ground is non-irrigated, and that's something of a different perspective. And then you also talk about the cattlemen, the ranchers, the livestock producers. So I guess I would just argue for a lot of diversity and representation from the ag sector, just because there is so much diversity out there.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo what Dick just said. I was talking to a colleague recently, and I was asking him who's this exact question. He said, you need to focus on, it needs to be more rural, younger, more diverse, more indigenous, is what he said. And I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much for that perspective. Dan, you want to go ahead and ask a question?
I'll toss out I guess a controversial question, and it could apply to any one of the speakers. I thought they were great presentations this morning. But to what extent does perception, or more precisely misperception, play in impeding progress to finding a solution or solutions to our water quality issues?
jump all over that one to start. Because I feel like whenever we talk about the possibility that there may be an impact on health, people want causation and then they want to know who is to blame for it. And I think that that misperception stops us from trying to think about solving all the problems that are presented to that. So I have to admit to you, as a pediatric oncologist, I don't think we're ever going to find what the true cause is because there are so many different things that can cause cancer. But in that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to think about solving the problem because the problem impacts so many different aspects. You help water quality and you help the administration of healthcare within our state. You've done wonderful, wonderful things for people throughout our state, including farmers and rural communities and all of those people. But sometimes the perception of, whoa, 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 you're saying that the water is causing cancer in kids, that's not a message that is easily diffused. So I think that's a great question. I think you're exactly right. Oftentimes, I think it stops us from taking the steps that would be required to think about the problem.
Again, I'll ask another question. I like this, being able to ask my questions. So we heard a lot about nitrate, and I think everyone probably would agree that nitrates are most pressing and immediate water quality issue. But I guess I would just also ask the panel, what other things are on each of your minds in terms of other types of contaminants or other health impacts that we may be experiencing from water quality?
This we have resident experts in this room also. Maybe I can take the opportunity to speak on their behalf. Carrie Weber here, she has done a lot of work in Nebraska relating the dissolution of uranium with respect to the presence of nitrate in the groundwater. So we have also other contaminants, arsenic. Martha Rhodes is here. She has worked on especially the combined effect of atrazine and nitrate, so nitroso-atrazine problems. So that is also shown to have animal cancer in the lab studies. And then the variety of other contaminants. We are a semi-industrial state and also a lot of military presence. So PFAS is another new emerging contaminant. We have atrazine everywhere. Lincoln, Omaha probably do the same thing in April particularly. They have to use powdered activated carbon to remove the atrazine before it is ozonated. So there are other things going on there. So this is probably, maybe Don can mention a little bit, we have a less mobile population here, but probably he can take that angle also, maybe supplement what I'm saying here.
Yeah, so I think there's been so much research that's been done on what possible links there are to disease and different pesticides, agrochemicals, contaminants in water, heavy metals. We talked a little bit about arsenic and causing cardiac defects in Native Americans. We know that. We've talked, there's been studies in California that have said if you live within 2 miles of a farm, your child's incidence of pediatric cancer is increased as if you didn't live within 2 miles of a farm. So no causality there, but just sort of saying there are things that are at play with that. I think one of the things that makes Nebraska special and allows Nebraska to sort of think about these problems is that they're going to be generational. None of these toxins are going to be something that most likely is going to cause disease immediately. There's going to have to be some kind of latency period. And I didn't come from Nebraska. I wasn't blessed to have been born here. I had to come from other places and show up. And all of you people are like a cult in some ways. You stay here for years. And when I'm having conversations with people and I say, "Are you from Nebraska?" and they say, "Yes." I say, "Are your parents from Nebraska?" "Yes." "Are your grandparents from Nebraska?" "Yes." And so to me, some of the potential for why we may be able to figure that out here is because if the population isn't moving, then there's more chance for them to be exposed to whatever those environmental toxins are. So the first question was sort of what other chemicals are you worried about? I'm worried about all of them because I don't know which one of them are going to be problematic. But I replace that worry with the idea that if we can show people that these are issues that we should talk about, then we get the next steps talking about, okay, we might not be able to fix all those problems because some of them we can't sort of stop or take back out of the aquifer. But we may be able to identify how our state can do a better job of taking care of the people that are most at risk of exposure to those different potential chemicals.
From a farmer's perspective, when Don threw up the slide of the other stuff that was found in groundwater, we don't think about that. We think about, all right, we've washed, we've applied a chemical onto the ground. Maybe it ends up in the river. Maybe it ends up on that and in that kind of water source. But we never think of it in the groundwater. And that was the one that gave me extreme pause because it's something we only talk about nitrates. And those of us who understand what's going on with uranium, but nothing from a pesticide standpoint. That is a very interesting one to me. That hopefully in the future, as we look at the change in farming coming down the road with some of the robotics and some of the changes within weed control mechanisms that we're going to have, that maybe we can slowly change that, but that's still a little ways down the road.
And I think the interesting thing might be the way that those chemicals interplay together, and the timing of when those chemicals are around, which I found very interesting from what you were saying as to when you have to apply something or the thought goes into that. There are a lot of smart people in our university system who can help understand when these two chemicals are together, how does it allow this one to be more bioavailable, or how does that become more problematic? And I think those are the things that we need to think about.
And as a slight tangent, what I think is really encouraging now about having people that are here and committed to Nebraska, and that this is, a lot of it's in our groundwater, is that we can't say this is somebody else's problem. We're going to send it downriver, which in other states, I hear that in the conversation. They're like, whatever, it's Louisiana's problem. And so we are dealing with our own problem, and how do we clean up our problem to benefit ourselves, which seems selfish, but on the other hand, that's how we think. And so I think it's helpful and encouraging to think about, we have people committed to our state and committed to our water, and we can use that as a launching point to start to work on solutions.
Is there another audience question? Go ahead.
Thank you. So my question is, this is a question that I often get, is that when I do my presentation and I say that Nebraska has a high incidence of pediatric cancer, and we're making association with waterborne agrochemicals, the question that I often ask is, does Iowa has the same cancer profile since they're also heavily agricultural?
Question. And the answer to that is that we are fortunate in Nebraska that, this sounds terrible about Iowa, and I don't mean it this way, but it was something that Nebraska wanted to fix, okay? When you think about a disease like pediatric cancer, it's exceedingly rare, okay? Pediatric cancer is only 2% of the cancer that we see. So if you're going to look at numbers and you're going to do it in a 5-year time frame, which is how the federal government looks at cancer incidence, you are not going to get stable numbers because there's going to be so much noise. You can go out to some place like Valentine, and if one kid in Valentine has cancer within 10 years, it's going to look like Valentine is a nuclear power plant because there's nobody else there. But if you look at it for a longer period of time, that's helpful. Some health departments are more likely to share that data than other health departments. And I hope I said that in a politically kind way. So in Nebraska, we are fortunate that our health department thought that this was a big enough issue that, yes, you guys can have 23 years of our cancer data. And if that shows up and tells people that Nebraska is this place where you don't want to come, we're going to be sad about that, but we'll let you look through that 23 years of data. A lot of states are not as open to that because that's not going to look good sort of for a marketing team to say, look at all we have. I think if we were able to look at Iowa's data with the same sort of eye and the same sort of length, we may be able to see something that's a little bit closer, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So briefly, maybe somebody else can pick it up. I can give an example for my wife who has a degree in English literature, but she gets giggles when she sees signs about drinking on the tanks, over a tanks, water supply in small towns, public water supply, so protect the land. So then the Torm watershed. So these are the kind of the things people like to know what it is because they're not aware of these things. So the little sign on the top of the tank that this is a drinking water source, protect the land around that carries a lot of meaning, especially the next generation, people coming from whether they are in this business or anything that's going to carry the message that there is some problem probably we have to deal with. So I can stop here.
I would want people to know that science is hard. And if COVID taught us anything, it's that people are wanting an answer now, and that answer better not change, and that answer better be the same, and science isn't like that. I'm lucky in this room. I look around and I see some of the scientists that I work with, like Dr. Ann Anderson-Berry, Dr. Eric Peoples, very, very smart people who I think would agree with me and say that part of the problem is that we want everything to be so instantaneous and to be completely solved. And like you said, it's not that. You have to look at it with perspective and with time. So I think that we need a little bit of a degree of just an understanding that having a conversation and thinking about all the different parts of the problem is incredibly important, because the science is hard. We can figure it out. We have the people to figure it out, but people have to be a little bit understanding that it takes time to get to the bottom of it. But while we're taking the time to get to the bottom of it, it's going to unravel other issues that we should be talking about. Quality versus quantity, public health, all the other things that we've said. So I think I just want people, science is good, but science is hard.
Great answer. Another question, go ahead.
So you asked the question at the beginning, who else should be at the table? I would suggest that our elected leaders in our state should be at this table, and I wish some of them were in this room today. And so I work for a natural resource district, and of course we have locally elected boards, so we do have some locally elected officials who are engaged in this issue. But I think in our state, up to the highest levels, our elected leaders need to be engaged in this issue. And when you see some of these statistics, where Nebraska is the 7th highest in the nation, I think we should be very concerned about that. And the social and economic viability of our state depends on that. So my question to the panel is, how can we effectively engage our elected leaders in aiding in the solutions on this issue? Loaded question for you. So.
Well, I want to dovetail off of the previous question too, and from our initial conversations, getting a lot of stakeholders involved, which probably we need more of our elected people at those as well, is that it partially depends on, you need to build trust, and it's trusted messengers, and that's why that piece really came out in our awareness piece, is a lot of times it's who you hear it from. I mean, to use COVID as an example again, a lot of the problems around that, to put it that bluntly, came from who said what about it, and when it turns into a political issue, science doesn't matter. I have a lot of communication background, and I'm really excited to hear the communication specialist later on, because science is a piece of it, but when we start talking policymakers and decision makers, it really becomes a whole nother set of science. And to have those, instead of calling them the softer sciences, I like to call them the harder sciences of communication and human behavior. We need to get those people engaged, and people who are skilled at it. And those include our policymakers. I mean, they've been elected because they have some skill set and they have some advisors who are good at it. And so getting some champions from that world on board to help us talk about how we engage and how we message this so that it's heard by different audiences. It depends on how you frame it. Are we talking about economic development? Are we talking about children's health? Those things land for certain people far differently than if we're talking about how we do environmental control or hydrogeology. So it's just conceptualizing the topic would be my take on it. Others want to jump in.
Yeah, Crystal, I'd really tend to agree with that. Maybe disagree a little bit in that, the science doesn't mean anything, and I know that's not what you were trying to say. Yeah, it's more exactly what you said, is how do you present the science to the people who need to hear it? And I guess that was one of the things that I was trying to get to in my presentation, is that in my history working with the NRDs, we have spent the last several decades talking about the hard science, the geology, the chemistry, that sort of stuff, which is absolutely vital, and we need to keep that going. But now we need people like Doug and Jesse and people with medical backgrounds to really talk to the policymakers, whether it be an NRD board member, Brian, or a state legislator or whatever, that, okay, we've got all this great scientific data, and now it's starting to lead us down this path where we're starting to make connections with actual people's health and people's lives. And that's why I think we need that partnership between the more hard science background and the medical science and then the communication. And Keith, to your point earlier there, one thing that Doug said was science is hard. I would just add to that, science takes a while, which he got to, but science is also expensive. We need to keep investing in the science or we're going to have problems.
So I want to give a little bit of optimism to your question. The Pediatric Cancer Research Group, which I'm honored to lead, was started in 2014 because the state of Nebraska gave $1.8 million to myself and a number of different investigators to sort of get at some of these problems. And the state of Nebraska makes that appropriation every single year. So a number of the slides that you saw are directly from the Senate giving that influx of money specifically for pediatric cancer. So it can't be utilized for adult cancer or anything else. That's one. And two, a number of senators have been very, very invested in hearing this. I've had the honor of speaking at appropriations about sort of the issue with pediatric cancer. So I do think that we have the investment of some of our elected leaders. And then the next step that becomes a little bit harder is the policy, sort of moving things forward, getting to these answers. The resources are important, but it's also important to have somebody who's going to drive the policies that are going to help us get to the answers.
We are running close to the end of our session, but we have one more question. I want to give him an opportunity because he's been standing patiently. So go ahead, and then we'll answer and wrap up our session.
Dick was hoping he'd talk long enough I wouldn't get asked a question. But actually, my question's for Brandon. And in all fairness to you, Brandon, I'm with the Central Platte NRD. So you made one comment that I agree with 100%, is producers don't talk about water quality. So how do we get them to talk about water quality? We have about 900 producers in our district that have had to fill out the crop report forms, do their soil tests since, I think, 1986 or 1987. They've been doing that. And honestly, we work with a tremendous amount of one-on-one. They're good producers. They're good people. But it's always their neighbor's problem, not theirs. It's their, water moves. And you know what I'm talking about. I know you do, but we have a tremendous amount of research. We have a tremendous amount of educational information available to us, and we share that as much as we can. But I agree with you. They don't talk about it. They might one-on-one, but they don't with their neighbors. They don't anybody else. So I got to admit to everybody, I'm a little skeptical when it comes to the educational part of it, because we've been doing education for 35 years and we've gotten nowhere with it. It's going to take something more than that. And it's going to take the policymakers to make that happen, is what I think. But maybe you have a suggestion for us of how we can get producers talking about that kind of stuff, because that's really what we need.
All right, I'm going to completely talk off the top of my head, see if I can get somewhere logical. But I think it's a challenge of what we had with the NRDs is that we've done a really good job about talking quantity. I think we've finally hammered that home. And I'll just go with my NRD is we worked on it, worked with UNL Extension, got the soil moisture sensors in place, seeing guys around us that I could tell you who was going to irrigate when, based on when their crop was planted and what it looked like. And all of a sudden one day I realized their pivot's not running. Week passed, the pivot's not running. I looked out there, they have sensors out there. They finally believed the data of what those sensors were saying, and we're seeing more of those pop up. So I think we've got the quantity thing sort of figured out in a lot of guys. There's always those outliers. I would think that the next stage, we talk about it. If they can make the next step in those sensors to do a better job of measuring nitrates and measuring whatever else they need to measure, and we can get that data and the guys can actually see what's going on, we can make that next step. Because you're right, it's somebody else's problem. We have wells that are popping high on nitrates that were dry land for 40 years. We know right where that water's coming from. We're managing it well, but we see the nitrates creeping up. Is that my problem? Well, it wasn't my fault. I mean, I was barely born at the time when those guys didn't know what they were doing, put on nitrogen. But but it's something I have to deal with, and I have to protect the neighbors down the road, and how can I do it? So it's a matter of if we can get the right tools in place for them to help all of us as farmers understand the importance of it. I think we can get them to the quality standpoint. It's just we don't see it, we don't think about it until you know. The only time we really talk water quality is when we see you know, whether it's atrazine put on and we get a huge flush, you know, we get that big May rain and it sticks it in the river. Or we have guys who put on phosphorus in the winter and all of a sudden you do have that melt and you see the bubbles forming of the phosphorus running off. But we don't think about, well, where I'm at, that ends up in the Blue River. That ends up down in the Kansas City area. Well, once you put those things together, it makes sense. But yeah, you're right. We want to blame it on the neighbor because we don't want to fix it ourselves.
If I could just jump in real quick, I'll give you a real short answer to your question, Lyndon. You said you're a little skeptical about education. I'll tell you how to get farmers talking to each other. Talk about new regulations.
Renee, did you have
Well, I'll
something?
jump in real quick too. I think that's a really great question about the education, and of course I'm new to the game, but what about, I mean, have we been directing the education to the right audience is my question. You know, maybe the producers aren't our target audience for the education. Maybe our target audience should be the youth. Maybe it should be the families of the producers. Maybe it should be the seed companies and the seed dealers, and maybe it should be our public health departments, you know. So when I'm thinking about like a statewide campaign of education, the producers are more on the periphery of that because they have been, you know, educated for, you know, we've been talking, you guys have been bombarded with education. So, you know, if we can establish a common denominator of education and a baseline of knowledge around the links between public health, water quality, soil health, you know, hydrogeology, then what happens? Is there political will that happens? You know, that's kind of my question around the education.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump on that real quick because I think that's an important point. For comparison, the movie Silo came out, I don't know, a year ago, and it's dealing with grain bins. And we took our families up to it. My brother and I both did. Neither one of our wives want any of our children going in a grain bin, and they only let us do it because somebody has to get in there and clean the grain bin out. So that might be a good point, is that you start developing that messaging to the families that resonates, because that one resonated really well.
If it's okay, I'm going to let maybe Renee close us out with it. Did you have a comment?
I wanted to make this comment that one is, it is important to include the youth. You know, if you're going to have, you know, everyone coming to the table, then you better have, you know, the young people coming forward so that they also can be a part of this process. And also, you know, as I'm listening to everyone, what we're talking about is responsibility. And it doesn't matter, you know, who's doing what, you know. It's almost like, to me, it's like producers versus, you know, the academics and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what it really does come down to is responsibility. And each person, as, you know, again, you know, going back to a philosophical point of view, when I was learning about how people come together and work together. You know, it's always about whatever language you want to use. You can say, you know, the pros and cons of it, or you know, the benefits. And I heard that statement about, you know, that everyone can win. So if you want to take that approach, then what it requires is a responsibility. Each individual, you know, whether that's producers or each organization, each state representative, they all need to make, you know, that commitment. They need to make that commitment to be, you know, responsible. So I speak from an indigenous point of view because that's how we lived. We lived with responsibility and commitment to taking care of the land and the water. And what that meant was, this was something that was embodied in us. And I know that again, in a Western philosophical approach, that's not necessarily that approach because there's a disconnection there. That process needs to involve that connection. So that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that, in the producer's part, that education, however you want to take that, but that they realize that there is, a responsibility. They bear a responsibility to how the water quality, will be maintained for everyone and for the future. Because we haven't even talked about, the children, and how this is impacting them, especially in regards to cancers and so forth. I mean, I don't hear that discussion every day, but I do know about it because, as an Indigenous person, everyone that I know, whether it's in my family or throughout my tribe, are all impacted by diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And again, it goes to, like I said, environmental justice. Why is that? So when you look at those factors and how they affect a community, whether it's rural or urban, what is really going on here? And to me, it's like I hear this and I'm like, responsibility. So if we're all responsible, whatever you want to call it, whatever roles we're taking. But if you're looking at it as you're all a part of this, you're all being the game changers here. Then that's the part that you need to examine fully. It's not academic, just or it doesn't just passing the buck kind of experience. This is real, and I can say most of my family have passed away from diabetes or cancer or heart disease. That's the impacts of the environment, not just our diet, because they always blame it on our diet. And I'm like, what are we consuming then? Water and food, which are impacted by what's being put in the water and food. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Renee. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think we all can recognize that this is probably the start of a conversation that will hopefully continue into the future.